Hello, I am Dr. Cinema. Now, we are in the month of October of Halloween, and you all know how much I love Halloween, how much I love horror. But I don't think many people truly understand the history of horror as terms in cinema. So today I decided to look back over the history myself and give you a brief history of cinematic horror. At least mainly from an American perspective, I think you'll get the gist of it. And I've divided them up into different eras for you to understand. So, without further ado, let's get right down to it. The first era of cinematic horror is from 1889 to 1930. And for lack of a better name, I'm just going to call this the beginning. Now, the start of this era was mainly a bunch of silent films, a bunch of shorts, because movies in general were just a really new thing at the time, and people were just sort of experimenting with it, deciding what they can and can't do. And during this time, the first, what's many considered to be the first horror film, is actually a French film, really, called Le Manoir des Diables by Georges Méliès. It's it's hard to pronounce, but roughly translates the haunted house. And if you want to look it up, you can Google it for yourself. But that's considered the first horror movie. But there are a bunch of other films during this era that are worth mentioning as well. For example, in 1910, we've got our first cinematic take on Frankenstein, which will of course lead to countless other adaptations and reimaginings of the famous creature. And of course, you have other films such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera, and actually, there's a movie called The Man Who Laughs, where the character, the man who is always smiling and laughing, served as influence for a comic book character, the Joker. But that film was sort of like one of the very first films to incorporate sound into movies. But the one movie that But if you take anything from this era, the one movie that's probably the most important is Nosferatu. Considered the first Dracula film, even though it's technically not Dracula. It's still a very well made film. It's got that gothic aura, that fear, that just sort of atmosphere that just makes horror what it is, a great genre. And so it's basically this era is just experimenting, find out what they can't do, and trying to do what they can to scare audiences. So and that's pretty much the beginning era, which went from 1889 to 1930. But now let's get to the good part, 1931 to 1949, the golden age of horror. Now, the number one thing about this golden age that makes it so memorable is that this was the time period dominated by the Universal monster movies. And while there was variety in how the Universal monsters got their own films, there was a very big gothic feel in pretty much all of them, ranging from Dracula to Wolfman to Mummy to the creature from the Black Lagoon. And in 1931, we actually got two films that kickstarted the Golden Age, with Dracula starring Bela Lugosi and Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff? Yeah, I think that's his name. And actually, that Frankenstein movie, it it actually set a trend for horror genre. I mean, the ending was changed in order for there to be a sequel that was later created in 1935, The Bride of Frankenstein, which is also considered one of the greatest sequels of all time. And this is where they sort of started the whole sequel thing, even though sometimes we used to think horror movies didn't get sequels, but it what set the bar. This set a lot of trends of the horror genre. And even though the last recognized original Universal Monster film actually came out in 1960, The period of 1931 to 1949 is what many people consider to be the best of the Universal monster movies, with the Invisible Man, the Wolf Man, Mummy. It's just a whole lot of stuff, and and for those of you who are subscribers, I already looked at a few of these different movies, including Dracula, Frankenstein, and Bride of Frankenstein. And these movies, even though they're really pretty short, only going just a little over an hour, it's still wonderful to see. And these are movies that you should definitely check out. And the golden age of horror is from 1931 to 1949. Now let's get into the next era, 1950 to 1967. I decided to call this era experimentation. This is where horror movies sort of started straying away from the whole gothic themes of the previous eras and started going towards more contemporary themes, such as actually some science fiction stuff a little bit. Because this is sort of where we got the emergence of a subgenres of doomsday films and demonic films of supernatural. Well, there were supernatural films, but like supernatural from like a demon angel perspective. And even though Godzilla movies aren't really considered like to be really like traditional horror, you can argue that the Godzilla monster movies are sort of horror in themselves, seeing as how they're created by radiation, how that could actually be fearful. But let's not get into even the Godzilla films. So really more of a side note in this era. So the big deal of this era was that it was a real focus on science and going with that, like straying away from the whole gothic themes. And actually, even though the main focus was on science, there are two films that came out that will set the characteristic of the next era. In 1960, we got the release of two movies. The first one is actually a British film named Peeping Tom, and that's considered to be the first slasher film. And later that year, Alfred Hitchcock gave us the first American slasher film, Psycho, starring Norman Bates. And that helped cement the subgenre in horror and in America. But again, the main focus was on science films, aliens, other beings, that sort of thing. But let's get into the next era, the era that everyone talks about these days. 1968 to 1989. The Silver Age of horror. Now, this Silver Age kicked off in 1968 with the release of, again, two films very similar to the Golden Age. We've got Rosemary's Baby, that sort of Antichrist film that was really well received and is considered a modern horror classic. But we also got Night of the Living Dead by George Romero. That really brought the modern day zombies into the mix, that really made the zombie genre what it is today. And really, that's something to be admired. But also, the whole thing of the Silver Age was that the counterculture at the time, like the hippies, the counterculture sort of began influencing horror itself, and sort of begin exploring horror movies in general because they're the counterculture. They want to find something new, something that's sort of against the trend. And so this actually brought, and you can see the influence in actually two of Wes Craven's first movies, The Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left. I won't really get into much detail about those two movies, other than saying to go check them out yourself, but you can probably see where the counterculture stuff is in that one. But also, there is a bit of counterculture influence in other films, such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But again, I won't really delve too deep into that, but sort of like a for veganism sort of argument in that movie, you could argue. But let's get into some more bigger characteristics of the Silver Age. This is the same era where Stephen King books started to become adaptations, starting with Carrie in 1976. Yeah, 1976. And of course, a few years later, in 1979, a TV adaptation of Salem's Lot, and from there, the rest is history. and Stephen King's already become like part of horror itself. And also, this is where you see more psychological and supernatural horror as well. And in those films, we started to see that murder really wasn't like the main theme or idea in those movies. They were, but they delved much deeper than that. And while we did see those films pop up in that era, the real thing that defined the Silver Age in the last decade was the rise of slasher films. Now, truth be told, in 1974, either 1972 and 1974, we got the release of Black Christmas, which is considered to be like the first, which is considered to be the slasher film that sort of like perfected the subgenre. However, a lot of the credit actually goes to the 1978 movie Halloween, and it did its fair job in like mastering and perfecting it, but it's really credited with popularizing it in mainstream media. And that's what set up the trend of slasher movies in the 80s. This is where we got our Friday the 13th, uh, Night, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play. Hell, we even got the first, I think we even got the first two Hellraiser movies in there, and those are considered the best of that. And this is just really, when people today talk about like great horror movies, this is usually the Silver Age. This is usually the era that they're referring to with all these cult favorites, all these modern classics. And to be fair, the Silver Age has a lot of good stuff in it. So please, if you really haven't checked out some these movies, please go and check them out for yourself. They really are pretty damn great. But of course, the Silver Age can't last forever, and in 1989. 1989 is when it ended. And so we get into the next era of horror. 1990 to 1999. I was pretty much just calling this the transition. And the reason I say it is because while the slasher movies of the 80s were great and all, people were starting to get bored with like all the gore, all the violence, all the murder. And there were a lot of sequels like focusing on that in the 80s and a lot of gory films, and the people that grew up with those movies just wanted more. So this is sort of where horror began to transition from what it usually did and started trying to come up with more better, clever, smarter ways of to scare their audiences. And really the two main ways for a horror movie to be successful in this time period was they either have to be ironic and maybe even a little bit of a parody, self-reflexive. Oh, so it's either like metafictional where they sort of like become a little bit parody, or they're self-reflexive of not just horror but of human society and civilization itself. And there are actually some good movies that did come out during this time. I mean, we've got the Scream franchise from Wes Craven that really took a stab at being self-reflecting of the slasher genre that he helped create and become popular. But we also have other films such as New Nightmare that really focus on like that actually focus on like horror and sort of their influence in popular culture. We have Silence of the Lambs. This really was a psychological horror movie that actually try to scare you not through murder or violence, but through the psychology of the criminal mind. And we also have another famous movie, Candyman, which is self-reflexive, not really horror, but of human society and how we act and behave with each other. And so there were a lot of great hits coming out, but there are also some subpar movies as well. Which brings us to the next era, 2000 to 2011, new century horror. And this era in general, it's a mixed bag. I mean, you have your great films such as Saw, and then you also have American versions of J horror movies such as The Grudge and The Ring, which were well received. And you also got other films from non-English speaking countries, such as the Spanish-Mexican Gothic horror film Devil's Backbone, which is directed by Guillermo del Toro, this guy who directed Hellboy. But ultimately, the reason why this is mixed bag, because even though we did get some good ones, the norm of this era seemed to be horror movies that were really just trying to be cashed in for a big and quick buck. And that's where we got a lot of subpar horror movies. This is when people begin saying, "Oh, horror movies are all just the same." Like I can already tell what's going to happen before I actually see it, because this is when studios begin to realize that horror movies could be made very cheaply and still make a lot of money, and that really sort of like began damaging at the horror genre itself. And but ultimately, people were beginning to want more from horror. And hold on, I got some notes here. Yeah, like people were beginning to get frustrated with all the cliched and generical horror movies that really pose no scares, no creativity, no imagination. And this is also we begin to see remakes of classic horror movies, specifically from the Silver Age. This is where we got our Rob Zombie remake of Halloween, of Friday the 13th, of Nightmare on Elm Street. And while that did like begin to also occur in the next and last era of horror, this is where it sort of began. But the next era that I want to talk about is the era that we are currently still in right now. And it began back in 2012. And this is what I'm decided to call the Bronze Age. And this is when horror movies started to actually become creative and imaginative again. And I credit the start of this current Bronze Age with the release of the Joss Whedon movie, The Cabin in the Woods, that really like was sort of like satirizing itself and also paying homage to basically every kind of horror movie, never going full satire, but still being a legitimately good horror movie. And so that really set the trend of horror movies becoming more challenging, becoming and begin to subvert traditional tropes of horror. And this is when the people are actually beginning to like horror movies again. But I think one of the main characteristics of horror from a cinema perspective during this era was it's not just movies anymore. It's the TV shows. We got shows like The Walking Dead, American Horror Story, The Strain, and Dexter that really became like horror icons of the smaller screen, allowing to delve more into the psychology of characters and beginning to delve more into other creative thoughts. And we also got shows that sort of like connected to like older, more classical stuff. I mean, this is where we got the show Bates Motel, which is sort of like a modern alternate prequel to Psycho. This is where we got the show Hannibal, which you could say is a sort of sequel to The Silence of the Lambs. But we also got more original stuff too. This is where we got the show Stranger Things. I mean, it's one of the shows. How can you not love it? But this is also where we began to see movies like becoming more connecting to like modern themes, more just being more relatable. I mean, we got The Babadook, one of the greatest independent horror movies of all time. And we also have the movie It Follows, where it deals with sex and teen culture, but not in the way you probably would think of that. And we also have the movie The Witch, which I understand is not everyone's favorite, but it's still very influential. And but more importantly, this is where we got Get Out, which is it's a horror movie. It's really more reflective of society, and it really did remind me more of like older horror movies, not just from like the 70s or 60s, but even the 30s and 40s. But I suppose one of the biggest trademarks of this Bronze Age is the Conjuring franchise, with two installments, two spin offs, and a couple more coming out. This is really horror movies becoming like, hey, we can be imaginative again, we can be creative, and we can actually be more modern, but also more timeless as well. And so this is the current state we're in. So it began back in 2012, but we're still I still like to say we're still in the middle of the Bronze Age, especially with films like It. I mean, that was a pretty great film. So this is so that's really a brief history of cinematic horror. So really, that's really all I've got to say. I just really love the horror genre, and I hope you share that same love with me. So prepare for a whole month of horror-related videos. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Dr. Cinema, see you next time.